So good evening. I appreciate everyone coming out today to hear the Corps of Engineers present their study findings on the flood mitigation study that the county is proposing. I'm Mark DeLuca. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Director of Public Works, and I wanted to bring up the county executive to say a few words about the study. And so to get things rolling, if I could have Mr. Ball come up.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much for everyone to come out this evening. I appreciate you joining us here, and I just want to also personally thank the Army Corps of Engineers for their work in leading this meeting tonight. When I took office in 2018, one of the things that I asked our Department of Public Works to do was to take another look at the flood mitigation plan for Ellicott City. The plan that was in place at that time required the demolition of 10 buildings on Lower Main Street and still left a significant amount of floodwater on Main. Public safety has always been a priority of mine, but I wanted to look for other options on Main Street that not only was safer, but retained as much of the historic charm as possible. I wanted to know if there were other options available to at least save some of those 10 buildings and still reduce some of the flood potential on Main. So our Department of Public Works went back to the drawing board, thank you, and they modeled more than 60 potential flood mitigation options to see how each one would reduce the floodwaters. And while they were also engaging in that process, our Army Corps of Engineers was engaged too. The Army Corps had already reviewed and affirmed our model, so we knew that our starting point was correct. But because of potential size of investment, we wanted them to take a closer look at the option that we were considering. So today, the Army Corps will be presenting the results of that review. I'm very pleased to announce that the Army Corps affirmed that we are following a sound process with regard to planning our flood mitigation efforts. Additionally, the Corps found that our current plan has significantly reduced flood risk to downtown Ellicott City. And while our main goal with respect to Ellicott City is reducing potential floodwaters on Main Street and in the West End, we've also taken numerous steps over the last year to improve public safety. These steps include mandating enhanced debris removal from streams in and around Ellicott City in order to keep our streams and culverts clear and prevent debris from causing damage during severe weather events. To date, we have removed more than 10 tons of debris from our streams. We purchased all of the 10 properties we intended to purchase at the bottom of Main Street, as well as several in the West End. And last year, we collaborated with the National Weather Service to better define their alerts so that when severe weather is headed to the historic district, there is minimal confusion. We also created a grant program to help property owners flood-proof their homes and their businesses. And along with affirming the effectiveness of our flood mitigation plan, the Army Corps also included in their report a series of considerations for additional measures that the county can take to further reduce flood risk. Many of these measures are already in place, while others have already been evaluated but not implemented for several reasons. Any measure mentioned by the Corps that we have not already considered will be thoroughly evaluated by our team for implementation, possible implementation. And we have made great progress in Ellicott City, but we also know there's a lot of work to be done. We look forward to continuing to engage everyone in our community as we work together to make Ellicott City the model of resiliency for our nation. Thank you.
So just a few notes on how we'll run the meeting. I'm going to have the Corps of Engineers come up. And first, I just want to thank them personally for the work that they've done for us. And I want to acknowledge Stacy Underwood with the Corps and Andy Lehman with the Corps. Also, we have our consultant, McCormick Taylor. Andy McLean is here. And I have Mark Richmond from our Stormwater Management Division is also here. So what we'll do is I'll bring the Corps of Engineers up for their presentation. Then after the presentation, we'll have some Q&A. Hopefully, we'll be walking around with a microphone for you to take questions up here. And then about 8:30, we do have a hard stop. So not to delay it any further, I'm going to bring Andy with Army Corps of Engineers.
All right, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. My name's Andy Lehman. I'm the project manager for this study, and I'm from the Baltimore District Corps of Engineers. Sorry, 1 second, let me get situated. And we have a lot of information to cover, so I'll try not to rush it. But first I want to say thanks for all you folks for coming tonight. Thank you for the county executive giving us a few words, and for the Howard County Department of Public Works for organizing this tonight. So without further ado, I'll start by walking you through what we'll be discussing tonight. If folks want me to get into the mic, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just try and speak up. But I'll cover the background and purpose of this study, why we're here. We'll take a brief look at the study area that was covered. Most of the folks here are going to be very familiar with that, but we'll take a look at it nonetheless. We'll review some of the flood history for Ellicott City, look at the alternatives. The county executive mentioned the 60 alternatives that were modeled. We'll discuss briefly what some of those were comprised of. And without getting too far into the presentation, I'll give you a summary of the Corps' takeaways so that not everybody's waiting in suspense. And then we'll get into the methodology, so how the Corps arrived at our key findings, and discuss the specific FRM measures that were reviewed by the Army Corps team, and then discuss potential or additional FRMs, flood risk management, excuse me. Just want to define some acronyms. You might hear me say FRM once or twice. That's flood risk management. So additional flood risk management strategies for the county's consideration that were identified by the USACE team. That's one other acronym, Army Corps of Engineers. I'll try to stick to the Corps, but if you hear me say USACE, that's the Corps of Engineers. And then we'll get to our results and conclusions and get on to the question and answer. So the background of this study, of course, the two devastating floods that occurred in 2016 and 2018, those flash flood events resulted in a number of studies undertaken by Howard County to attempt to identify how to prevent future events from occurring at such an extreme level. And as the county moved through their studies, they requested the Army Corps to come in and perform an independent evaluation of those studies, of the modeling that occurred. So when I say modeling, I'm talking about modeling the storm events, and then also how the river systems flood in response to those storm events. And the Corps identified additional strategies for the county to consider moving forward. So the Corps began this process by assembling an independent team of flood risk experts. They were intentionally assembled from outside of Baltimore District. So Baltimore District managed the project. So myself and Stacy helped coordinate getting that team together, organizing the meetings, bringing them here for a site visit, and preparing this presentation and the report. But this team of experts came from, we'll look at it in the next slide, but it was multiple engineering disciplines, civil, hydraulic, geotechnical. We had a community planner, a cultural and environmental specialist, and a national non-structural flood-proofing committee member as well. And as part of this review, we tried to leverage as much of the flood expertise that the Corps had access to. So we gave a presentation to the Maryland Silver Jackets, it's an interagency flood risk management group. So it has federal, state, and academic partners involved. And they were given basically as much information as we were given access to within a PowerPoint presentation as best we could. Their input was solicited, and that was incorporated into this report. Additionally, we performed that same sort of presentation to a national audience of just Army Corps flood risk experts via webinar, and we had something like 60 flood risk experts from across 20 Army Corps districts spread across the country, with 7 different areas of expertise involved in that as well. So we leverage as much expertise as we possibly could for this. And just as a caveat, the Corps did not, we reviewed the completed studies by the county, but we did not develop any of our own engineering designs or modeling as part of this effort. And the Corps was not tasked with and is not providing specific recommendations. We evaluated the measures and provided advantages, challenges, and considerations for the county. And the Corps has not been involved in the county decision-making. Again, this is an independent review. So moving on to the next slide here. So our team, I mentioned already some of the background of the team members. We conducted our site visit in May of 2019. A little bit on previous Army Corps involvement in and around Ellicott City and Howard County. So in July 2009, we did some work updating flood maps for the Ellicott City watershed. July 2016, we performed a debris clearing effort from the Patapsco and from the tributaries to there running through Ellicott City. And in 2017, as Executive Ball mentioned, the Corps was involved in reviewing McCormick Taylor's hydraulic and hydrologic modeling. And in February 2018, some of you folks may have seen there was a non-structural flood-proofing study done for Ellicott City that gave examples for flood-proofing buildings in the historic district. So for the study area, I won't spend a lot of time here. Folks are familiar for the most part with the watershed, but highlighted there in red is your downtown Main Street area at the convergence of about a 3.7 square mile watershed with the Patapsco just to the east. And in the downtown historic district, you have the confluence of multiple streams originally harnessed for their stream power for mills, the Hudson, the Tiber, the New Cut, all flowing around and sometimes underneath the city, joining the Patapsco. The flood history here in Ellicott City, as folks are aware of, has occurred 2 different ways. What we're referring to here as bottom-up or Patapsco River flooding, so from the bottom of the watershed, and then the top-down, which are the steep, flashy flash flood events that occurred in 2016 and 2018 were examples of those. And since 1868, at least 7 recorded major flooding events, some of them pictured here. Very briefly on the 2016, 30 July 2016, circled there in red, the cumulative rainfall over a 2-hour period was nearly 6 inches, recorded at the rainfall gauge here near downtown Ellicott City. The May 2018 flood, about 6.5, 6.6 inches of rainfall occurred within approximately 3 hours. So once the USACE team was assembled, the Corps team was assembled, we were starting with those 60 modeled alternatives. Each alternative, I'll try to be specific as far as the difference between alternatives and measures. An example of, so each alternative was comprised of anywhere between 1 and 14 of these measures. Some examples of the measures include things like the underground diversion tunnels is one example. A culvert addition or improvement would be another one. but it also included above-ground storage ponds, below-ground storage structures, floodplain modifications, so the terrace floodplain, which includes things like building removal, and conveyance improvements, which could also include building removal or modification. And so the team was also made aware of some other steps that the county had already taken. So what are referred to as non-structural flood risk management measures, including the flood warning system that the county's been was in the process of sort of calibrating while we were conducting our study. Evacuation planning, like the signs that are seen in downtown Ellicott City, and had also established a flood-proofing fund. So our team was made aware of these efforts while we were in the process of conducting the study. And just as a note, we'll look later on in this presentation, but the Corps also identified a couple potential evacuation related measures or strategies for the county. So sort of the bottom line up front, the key takeaways from this evaluation is that the county considered a thorough array of flood risk management efforts or measures and backed by sound modeling. The measures considered by the county can effectively reduce flooding for Ellicott City, and those are the same types of FRM measures, so like diversion tunnels, expanding culverts, storage up in the watershed. Those are the same types of measures that the Corps considers in its own FRM projects. And based on the evaluation, we'll look at the specific results, but based on the team's evaluation of the top measures that we identified, the county's plan, known as 3G70, includes many of the top measures as the Corps team identified. The Corps identified additional FRM strategies. We'll talk about those tonight as well for the county's consideration. And additional takeaway is that no matter how you try to address flooding, there's always remaining risk. And so the county is aware of this, but the Corps just stressed in this report that Howard County should continue to pursue things like additional acquisitions of properties, flood proofing of buildings, flood warning systems, and evacuation planning, as these are sound ways to further reduce risk. So getting into the methodology of the study, so starting with these 60 modeled alternatives, we looked first at the alternatives that significantly reduced flood depths and velocities based on the hydraulic model that we were provided with. So looking at essentially the 2016 storm event, of the 60 measures, we looked at 4 locations. They're highlighted there with the 1, 2, 3, and 4. So from Lower Main Street up towards the west end. And we looked at which alternatives significantly reduced flood depths and velocities down to a target area of approximately 3.5 feet for depth and about 5 feet per second or below. The alternatives that met that criteria we included for further evaluation. The ones that didn't, we excluded at that point, as one of the county's main goals was to get those depths and velocities down low enough that you can then protect structures with non-structural flood proofing. So that's about the limit at which you can do that. So that reduced the number of alternatives considerably from 60 down to 8. And of those 8 alternatives, there were 12 unique measures. So I know the terminology is a little much, but I'll show you the 12 measures right here. So these were the top measures from the reducing depth, flood depths, and velocity perspective. So starting with the downtown / upper Main Street area as far as location, the ones that made the list were the North Tunnel, South Tunnel, Maryland Avenue culverts, the terrace floodplain, the Lot D channel expansion, Lot F underground storage, and I'll be going through these each one by one, including showing a map so folks can follow along. West End floodplain conveyance, number 8, West End underground storage, and the remaining were a series of storage ponds, above ground storage ponds, and we'll look at those as well. So continuing another slide on the methodology, and then we'll look at each of those measures. But the way the team conducted this evaluation was essentially by developing a set of criteria by which to evaluate each of these measures. So these were developed based on reading through all the documents, the watershed master planning documents, in discussions with the county, and then based on the best professional judgment of the flood risk experts involved. We developed this list of 8 criteria. So those are prevention of loss of life. So the idea was for each measure, to what degree does it impact these criteria? So prevention of loss of life, to what degree does a measure reduce flood depths and velocity? What are the economic impacts of each measure? What's the impacts of preservation of historical/cultural values or community cohesion? Kind of lumped a few together there, but we looked at environmental impacts, operation and maintenance, initial construction costs, and what we call implementation duration. So how many years, or approximately how many years would it take before you have a functioning structure or a functioning system in place? So as a team, we assigned numbers to rate each of these measures against these criteria, and we were comparing each measure compared to one another, so relative to one another. So say North Tunnel compared to South Tunnel, what are the impacts as far as prevention of loss of life, et cetera. And we'll discuss some of those results here tonight, and I've got also a printout of that matrix, that evaluation matrix, and that will, of course, be, it's included in the report, so it'll be available online on Howard County's website afterwards for everybody to review. So starting with, so now we'll take a look at each of those 12 measures that made the cut as far as that depth and velocity initial criteria. So starting in the downtown area, then we'll move our way west upstream there. The first one evaluated here was the North Tunnel, and I'll just give a little background on each one. It's circled there in black, and this is conceptual as far as location. This is not a specific, or this is not a full engineering design, but approximately 1,600 feet long. It was modeled at, it was reviewed by the team, modeled at about 15 feet or 15 feet in diameter. It's active just for storm flows, so that means when there's not a lot of water in the system, there's no water in the tunnel. And this outfall on the far right side of the screen there, the outfall is in the Patapsco River, and it's passing under the CSX railway line. So in addition to the matrix that we created, the Corps felt that it was most valuable to provide to the county for each of these measures what are the advantages, challenges, and considerations for each one. So this is really the kind of the meat and potatoes, both of the report and in the matrix as well. So I think I'm doing okay on time, but I'm not going to touch on all these. Again, these will all be available. They're in the report and will be available for public review. So, but I'll touch on a few for each one. So for the North Tunnel, some of the advantages included that there'd be little impact to historic structures. It would not have an impact to the community cohesion. So essentially, it's not a disruption to the downtown area, especially after construction. After it's complete, it's almost as if it's not there. And as a standalone measure, based on the modeling, the North Tunnel produced the most significant reduction to flooding downtown on its own. Some of the challenges include the cost. Of those listed, would be the most expensive. Significant engineering challenges included constructability and duration, so just boring a large tunnel through bedrock and passing under an active railroad line. Some considerations, this measure might require an impact statement, environmental impact statement, which takes additional time. There may be less costly options that might achieve similar levels of flood reduction, like the Lot D floodplain expansion we'll look at, but that would come with far more complications as far as extensive changes to downtown. And the county executive mentioned a program in place to manage upstream debris. That was something that the team brought up a number of times. You'll see that on these slides. And it's something that the county is pursuing already. So next up was the south tunnel. Shorter in length. It was modeled at various diameters, also active just when there's storm flows flowing through the channels. Also outfalls to the Patapsco River and passes under that same active railway. A lot of the advantages, challenges, and considerations are very similar for this one compared to the North Tunnel. The team did find, based on reviewing the model, that it was less effective hydraulically than the North Tunnel. So that just had to do with the slope of the tunnel, but essentially the North Tunnel was more effective in passing floodwaters. Next up is the Maryland Avenue culverts. So circled there in black with the letter B, and sort of zoomed in there towards the left. So this was modeled as about 275 linear feet long, two 10-foot diameter culverts passing from approximately Maryland Avenue, right where the Phoenix Emporium currently is, and outfalling to the Patapsco River as well. Some of the advantages, this measure also showed significant reductions to flood depths and velocities, both on Maryland Avenue and then lower Main Street below Maryland Avenue. Some of the challenges are similar to that of the tunnels. These are essentially just two smaller tunnels. And also a challenge for the Maryland Avenue culverts, it would require, just due to the nature of its location, it would require the removal of a number of the buildings, or some of the buildings on that southwest corner of the Maryland and Main Street corner. Up next is the terraced floodplain. So there's a lot going on in this slide, but the idea here was that there was those 10 buildings on Lower Main Street that various combinations were modeled by the county for either removal or modifying, so maybe removing the backs of the buildings that are over the stream. Many of those, or basically all those different sort of combinations were modeled and reviewed by our team as well. And the idea was to open up that Lower Main Street area as pictured in the top right was from this was the October 2019 Watershed Master Plan. This was an artist's rendering that some folks may be familiar with. In the lower right is the overhead rendering of that. So turning that area into an open space that allows for the water to rise, spread out, instead of pouring, being forced out more quickly onto the roadways. And during our review, the county's plan that they were currently considering, or had been at that time, still are considering, included the removal of 4 buildings. So the team was aware of that. Those are highlighted in green in the bottom left, and the backs of the buildings in green to be modified, either essentially the lower portions removed to make more room for the river, and or removed completely, with the buildings in purple to be maintained. So our team was made aware of what the county's current plan was at the time, and still is. So this is just a sort of further, for folks that, again, most folks are familiar with here, but pictured on the left, those building facades would remain in place, either the whole building or the facade, based on this current proposal. So for the terrace floodplain, some of the advantages that our team identified. So the Corps has sort of when it comes to reducing flood risk, a standard is that if you remove people from that flood risk area, you're going to save lives and you're going to reduce property damage. So the removal of those structures does both of those, and it has the potential coincident benefit of a few of these measures, although they were designed to address steep flash flooding events coming from upstream. if and when you have a Patapsco flood event, some of these measures would actually also help reduce risk with those. So for instance, this one, if you don't have buildings in place there and the Patapsco floods, you have a reduction in flood risk. The team felt that some of these parks that were envisioned or some of these downtown areas could over time actually become destinations for both residents and tourists visiting Ellicott City. Although it is a change, certainly that's one of our considerations or our challenges that I know we mentioned in the report is these obviously result in changes to the downtown feel. And I'll mention in a few of these slides, when I say there's an opportunity to develop riparian and in-stream habitat, so what I mean by that is anytime you're doing work in or alongside of a stream, especially if it was channelized like downtown area is, if you're going to open it back up, you can do things like plant trees along the banks. That's known as the riparian zone, so just alongside streams. And then within the stream, you can build structures, make the river or the stream a little more sinuous, and it introduces habitat for fish and insects. So some of the challenges associated with the terrace floodplain were real estate acquisitions. Those have all been complete to date. There's the ongoing issue of sediment and debris management, which Executive Ball mentioned is being undertaken by the county. Considerations, so I mentioned here what we call parapet walls, which are essentially small flood walls. So they can be designed at different sizes, but the idea is that they're of human height. They're not, maybe 3 feet high or slightly higher, but not, nothing massive. But you can include those along channelized areas to allow more water to pass through those areas. We also include, in consideration, placing bollards or basically a structurally reinforced object that would prevent things like large debris, cars, for instance, from getting into the channel. And I'll move on to our next one. So Lot D channel expansion, you see it circled there towards the left side. This includes, I'll show a couple more pictures and some renderings from the master plans to refresh everybody's memory. But it includes building removals, business relocations, reconfiguring Lot D, and we saw from the modeling a significant increase in conveyance capacity. So basically, this allows for more water to move freely and more easily through this area. So Lot D, as it currently exists, with your Hudson and Tiber running through and underneath. This was the, I believe, from the earlier watershed master plan, and this is how the team was presented with this potential measure, or at least an idea of what it might look like. So again, includes removal of, I believe, what is La Palabas, daylighting the stream, so the stream is often in culverts through this area, and creating an additional sort of terraced floodplain around that bend. And this rendering envisions a potential parking structure. So we saw as advantages hydraulically. The model showed that this measure significantly reduced flood depths and velocities downstream of there, so down on Lower Main Street. It, based on the team's best professional judgment, would be less costly than the tunnel options and opportunities for habitat improvement. But some of the challenges were the significant changes to this area, so the removal, relocation of, or modification of potentially historic structures. Impacts to, there's a main utility corridor running down Main Street, and then depending on Lot D's configuration, potential loss of parking. Considerations, parking could be potentially moved elsewhere, and we also saw for this one that over time this could be viewed as a pretty walkable park-like space that could actually draw people to it. And moving on to number 6, so this is what was known as the Lot F underground storage structures. So these would be below ground. Essentially, they can be designed different ways, but imagine a concrete vault that can fill with water when there's a flood flow passing by. So these two, they're slightly hard to see, but they're boxed off there in light blue. There's a H8 underground 1 UG1, and I believe an H1 UG1, and they combine for 33 acre feet, which is how we measure water storage. So we'll see a range of storage capacities in the next few slides. Excuse me. So there's calling them out there with those arrows, make it a little easier to see. So for these underground storage structures, they provide things like water quality benefits. So they capture sediments, which often include some pollutants. So they offer a water quality benefit. Because they're located underground, after the construction is complete, they're essentially invisible. So they have little impacts to the historic feel and look of downtown. Some of the challenges with anytime you're storing flood flows, if you have a large enough storm event and that structure becomes full, then it's no longer functioning, and basically it no longer reduces flood risk. So we'll see that with all the storage structures here as far as challenges. But these below ground storage structures are going to be more costly just due to the construction process than an above ground storage structure. Anytime you dig underground, especially in a place like Ellicott City, for all of these structures, you have the potential for impacts to archaeological resources. So that's something that we've made the county aware of, as far as you can start that process early to see if there are, conduct archaeological studies before digging. And these structures require regular cleaning. They fill up with debris and sediment. So moving from the lower Main Street, upper Main Street area, we'll move towards the west end. And the west end conveyance improvements is the 7th. And so this was looking at generally from the Ellicott Mills Drive upstream area. And this measure was designed to about double the capacity of the roadway culverts below Main Street and Frederick Road. So to pass more water underneath the road, keeping it within the channel. So advantages we saw from the model, that resulted in reductions to residential and roadway flood depths, but that it was most effective for smaller storm events. These, as they were modeled for larger storm events, they would be there would not be enough capacity for these culverts. But we saw, because of the potential extent along the streams that this project might entail, you had the potential for improvements to aquatic habitat. Challenges, potential for a number of real estate acquisitions, crossing the roadways, so crossing a utility corridor multiple times, which might result in, or would certainly result in, disruption to traffic flows during construction. And one consideration is when you're doing in-stream habitat improvements, you can potentially include what the Corps calls nature-based flood risk management measures. And if anybody's curious about that, I'm happy to talk about it after the presentation. So the next up was an additional underground storage structure in the west end, and this one was 30 acre feet in size, located here. So the advantages, challenges, and considerations are almost the same as per those previous underground ones I just discussed. So essentially the same thing, underground storage vault of pretty good size. So I'll move then on to the above ground storage ponds, and there were 4 of them that made the list, and they're pointed out here. So starting with number 9, what's known as the H7 pond, 13 acre feet, located in the it's kind of hard to see, but in the exchange between US 29 and US 40, sort of in that clover leaf. H4 pond, 16 acre feet. T1 pond, significantly larger, and the largest we've seen tonight here at 70 acre feet. And the NC3, so T1 is for Tiber, and NC new cut on one of the new cut branches at 63 acre feet. So these are, if you've driven around neighborhoods, you might have seen what looks like a dry pond. These would be designed slightly larger, slightly bigger, but designed to hold flood flows to a certain point and then release those flood flows much more slowly than if they were not in place. So the advantages, challenges, considerations are very similar to those underground structures, but these are a bit cheaper, and they're open air and visible. They're not below ground. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some measures that were identified by the Army Corps team for the county's consideration. So we ended up calling this one a targeted conveyance increases. And what we're trying to get at here is especially the lower portions of Ellicott City, you have a highly channelized system. So and a lot of these channels are old. And in some particular places they're not very big, so you have a lot of water trying to go through a small area. So what the team identified was generally as a concept, expanding channels, so either widening, deepening through dredging, and or putting these parapet walls or small flood walls along the tops of the channels. So if done throughout the downtown area, the idea was that you could potentially allow enough storm flows to pass through to potentially pass a 2016 size storm event in the channels. But it comes with plenty of challenges and considerations as well. So challenges associated with something like this is, first off, there's going to be a lot of geotechnical studies required, so you're going to be putting a lot more fast-moving water through these areas that are passing right along buildings. So something like this would certainly require structural studies of those buildings, but may require structural reinforcement of buildings that are right along the channels. There's the possibility that the channel walls themselves are historically significant. So you'd have archaeological or historic implications associated with that, including, even if they're small, including small flood walls throughout the downtown area could certainly impact the look and feel of downtown. And additional considerations, I think I maybe covered those. Actually, yeah. So move on to the next one. This next one is the team identified as a dry flood mitigation structure on the new cut. And what that would mean by dry flood storage structure, we mean one that doesn't hold water during normal sunny days. So it's, I'll pull up another slide here to show a little more detail as to where, but the new cut, the flood flows from the new cut contributed significant amounts of water to both the 2016 and the 2018 flood events. And a dry flood storage structure could be sized large enough to reduce peak flows coming from that subwatershed. Is it going to come up? Oh, dropped an arrow. So I've got on here, we'll look at three things. So T1 pond is on the left, just for comparison. That was the, I believe, 70 acre feet in size. What the team identified was, again, conceptual and hypothetical, but a potential location for the embankment to store ponding water behind a very large storm event, so similar to the 2016 storm event. You've got in red the possible extent of the ponding area. So you see it runs up and would actually cover parts of the New Cut Road. So that's one of the challenges is the New Cut Road under this conceptual design would have to be removed. There's a number of property acquisitions that would have to occur throughout that area. But the possible embankment location is highlighted there in black. I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. So the advantages for a structure of this size is that you could, again, significantly reduce those peak flows coming out of the New Cut. And that embankment and that reservoir behind it would actually capture a lot of the debris coming down the New Cut. So rock, wood, other debris. I mentioned some of the challenges would likely require relocation or closure of the New Cut Road. Acquisitions for numerous properties along the New Cut. It's likely that the state of Maryland, because of the size that the team conceptualized it as, something that would likely be classified as a high hazard dam. So that would require a particular type of engineering design and construction. The embankment would likely be roller compacted concrete. So the considerations, something of this size would require certainly an environmental impact statement. I think I mentioned a number of these, but some considerations for the county, including placement, could be placed so that it's not visible or limited visibility from the downtown area. And again, that ponding area behind the structure would remain dry when it's not. So it would only have water after a storm, and then it would be drained and it would be dry again. So it could potentially remain forested. So some additional strategies, flood risk management strategies identified by the Corps included, I mentioned a couple times, the environmental improvements. So we just want to make sure the county sort of had that on their mind as they're doing this work on streams. The team discussed or identified in the report potential for additional parking restrictions downtown. Anytime you can keep both people and their vehicles away from flash floods, you've got a potential to save lives when you do that. And of course, things like additional parking areas or shuttle services are something that the county would have to address and figure out. The debris removal program we talked about, so lots of times in these flash flood events, debris clogs the channels. I think I've got a good picture on the next slide. I know many folks saw those cars jammed underneath bridges, and those significantly add to further flooding once you get channels blocked up. And the team also identified potential for another evacuation sort of plan or route. Or we called it elevated egress walkways, but the team sort of conceptualized behind the buildings on Lower Main Street have some walkways that folks could vertically evacuate in buildings and then get to higher ground via these walkways. And three other FRM flood risk management strategies. So I just mentioned the vertical evacuation plans from the buildings. So you could have property and business owners responsible for making sure the folks in their building know how to get out during a flood event. And for modeling analysis, the Corps is recommending putting forth for the county's consideration that, and I think some of these the county may be pursuing, but modeling each measure, so each tunnel, pond, etc., measuring it or modeling it on its own so that you can look at the benefits for each one. And then including additional storms, so modeling more storm events essentially, because they're not all going to look like the 2016 or 2018. So having other ones to compare and contrast to, and then that can help decision making for which measures to select. And lastly, interagency collaboration. So as much as feasible, as much as possible, continuing to coordinate with particularly the National Weather Service to help improve forecasting for this flash flood area. So we made it through all the measures and strategies. So what came out? How did they shake out? So out of our evaluation matrix, we assigned scores, and I will say as a caveat, because we started with the ones that were already reducing flood depths and velocities, they all scored pretty well because they're all contributing in one way or to another to reduce flood risk. So we did have a top tier, it was our top third as far as scoring, and then our middle third as far as scoring, even though it's a small group, and our lower tier. But again, from the top to the lowest, there was not a tremendous amount of differentiation as far as scoring. But North and South Tunnel were at the top, and this was based on those 8 criteria I talked about earlier on. North and South Tunnel, the Corps identified that targeted conveyance increase ended up scoring towards the top there. The Lot D channel expansion, Maryland Avenue culvert, T1 pond, that was the largest. The NC3 pond was the second largest storage pond. In the middle tier, we have the terrace floodplain, that lower Main Street building removal. We have the H7 pond, and lower tier West End floodplain and conveyance. The Corps identified dry flood storage structure on the new cut, and then H4 pond, and then those underground storage structures near the bottom. And we went ahead and highlighted here in blue, based on the county's current selected plan, the one known as 3G70. Those in blue are part of that 3G7 plan. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 8, I believe. 8 of these 12 measures are part of that 3G7 plan. And our key takeaways, I stated it early on, but the Corps found that the county's processes were sound and that the modeling was robust. So those affirmed measures that were backed by the modeling. The measures considered by the county can effectively reduce flooding for Ellicott City, and those measures that they're considering are the same types that the Corps would use in their own FRM projects. The county's plan, as we just saw, includes many of the top measures as the team identified, the Corps team identified for this evaluation. And as we talked about, the Corps identified additional strategies and measures for the county's further consideration. Yeah, as I mentioned before, you can never totally reduce flood risk. So the Corps stressed in this report that the county continue to pursue, things like additional acquisitions, flood proofing of buildings, flood warning systems, evacuation plannings, to again try and further reduce risk, and ultimately, hopefully, save lives for future flood events. So that's it for the presentation here. I think we're going to open it up for Q&A, and I went ahead and included I believe the EC Safe and Sound is where ultimately this will all be, this report, the matrix, will be available there. So, all right.
Don't go too far.
Yep.
So I want to thank the Corps again for the efforts they put into this and the coordination with the national team. So we were going to have a mic, but apparently it doesn't work. So we're just going to, if you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you, and Andy or I or someone else who's up here might be able to answer the question. We do have a hard stop at 8:30, and we're doing well. We have about 30 minutes, and they do have a matrix board to actually show. So at the very end, I think we'll leave a few more minutes so that we can put the board up in the back and have people look at it and ask questions about it. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Yeah, I've got to say that I'm not aware of that, okay? And this study isn't looking at or should be coordinated with development as it might be occurring in the watershed, and I'm not aware of that, and or what impacts that might have overall on the plan. But I think that's a good question. Right. So what I'd like to offer, because possibly some of the people that may know are not in the room right now, is that we talk afterwards and I'll find out for certain. But I do think it's an important question. Yes.
Yeah.
What do you do with the fact that in the last flood event, the water was pouring over that wall, along the Jersey barrier on the bridge, and the change in elevation on the national bridge has gotten the water over Main Street. And it's actually heading to
So that's a good
you know,
question.
talking to the mic
Yeah.
for the streaming.
So the that pictured the photo that was up there was actually that is the existing wall. So for our study, for the purpose of our study, we presented very conceptual level ideas. So we didn't do any engineering designs or modeling. The specific issues you're talking about would have to be addressed in a proper engineering design. So we put forth to the county that this is something they could look at for widening the channel, basically identifying the areas where it would be most helpful to either widen or put in flood walls. And there may be places where it would actually be harmful from a flooding perspective to do so. So we weren't tasked with, we didn't have the ability to do a full-on engineering study. So we didn't have specific areas picked as far as, here would be the best spot for this type of improvement or this type of improvement for this conveyance improvement. Stacy?
That's great. If you don't mind me jumping in. And let me just add, I mean, that would be in addition to all of these others. So these other measures and alternatives would reduce the flooding quite a bit before we get to those walls. So this is, again, in concert with doing other solutions. So you would have less water coming down and maybe some smaller walls, and going deeper and wider may then help it because you've already held back some of the water or done these other measures. So it wasn't a standalone, it was in coordination with the other measures.
Yes.
Could you put a slide right before the conclusion slide?
Sure.
Show the evaluated measures.
Maybe
Yes.
this one here?
All right, so the ones that are, the text that is in blue,
Yeah.
those are the projects the county has selected. So half of those are in the middle and the lower tier. Am I understanding that correctly?
It would have, yes.
No.
Four in the top, four in the middle and bottom.
Yeah.
Well, there are 5 in the top tier, 2 in the middle tier, and 2 in the lower tier. So the dark blue, the dark blue are the county projects, the dark blue type. So in the top tier, the North Tunnel, Maryland Avenue culverts, T1 Pond, and C3 Pond. And then in the middle tier, the dark blue projects.
Right, so four of them are in the bottom two tiers. The reason I asked, we lived in Old Ellicott City, and so we're just curious as to how this is going to play out.
Right. Well, in which part of Old Ellicott
We
City?
live on Merriman Street, so by Monte,
Okay.
half of Monte.
Right. So, yes. So just as a point of interest, because the North Tunnel and Lot D channel expansion are on there. So if you look at them in isolation they have valuable flood reduction values, right? However, the county in its flood mitigation plan chose not to do the Lot D channel expansion because it chose to do the north tunnel. It was almost like an either or. You could either do.
Are some of those mutually exclusive, like the north and south?
Well, not necessarily the north and south tunnel, but the north tunnel and the Lot D expansion most definitely are. One was a lot more, even though the construction of it to build a tunnel has its own complexities and complications. What we would need to do for the Lot D channel expansion was essentially move pieces around, pick buildings up, move buildings for a certain number of years, then bring back buildings. And so it was seen to be, because the value of it was equal, essentially, if not actually tilted more in the North Tunnel favor in terms of hydraulics, the damage we would be doing to Lot D at the time didn't seem to be worth it if we could do the North Tunnel. So if you live on Hillman or Merriman, there are no plans for, no huge plans for Lot D.
Well, and I'm not asking because I'm married to any of these, I'm just one person.
Right.
That'd be what's best, obviously, overall. Just curious that four of them, four of the plans that the county's gonna follow are on the bottom two chairs, that's all. I just wanna make sure I understood that,
Right.
and I did, thank you.
Yes, and I'll make another point about the bottom two tiers, is that they're a lot of the West End projects. So the top tier is primarily treating the lower Main Street flood issues, and the middle tier and lower tier treat the West End, like west of Ellicott Mills, and so their flood mitigation potential is huge for the people and properties that are directly adjacent to them, but may not have as much impact on Lower Main Street than the top tier projects. So, yes.
You mentioned with putting bollards to protect against the property damage from flooding with the cars. Do any of these address parking on Main Street or reduction of parking on Main Street to prevent that kind of?
So these projects don't directly. However, it was one of the Corps' observations that, the parking on Main Street, having vehicles on Main Street could be problematic. And do you want to answer more specifically?
Sure.
In-
Yeah, so I think Mark sort of expressed it there. These measures, none of these had to do with parking, but the Corps it stressed in the report that, with vehicles and people trying to get to vehicles during flash flood events and the vehicles themselves potentially becoming, debris, that a way to reduce flood risk is to reduce the number of cars in those flash flood areas. So, we made that as sort of an observation and consideration for the county, but it's not part of any of these specific plans.
But it could be done with any of those plans.
Right.
Time and efficient.
Yeah.
And just another point about the bollards is that, we see it as a streetscape measure right now, the bollards, and we will be looking into it more to see how we can effectively use bollards on Lower Main and other parts, but particularly in Lower Main where we have vehicles can float down the road because of the steepness of the hill. So, yes.
I wanted to get a plan straight on that road. As far as the study and the plan, does it take into consideration the
So, right. So there's, the study takes into effect water at the sub-watershed level. If you were to do something on your property, or if someone was to do something on an adjacent property, these models don't take into consideration those changes because just by way of this model, that small acreage may not make enough of a difference in the overall model of like a 2016 storm. So understanding that, I think that there are measures. So the model just isn't as finely grained as that. But there are measures for what the impact of a subdivision or a new development would be in that sub-watershed. And it's a different evaluation. And now there are even different specifications and requirements that developers must follow in order to store the water, that floodwater, on site longer and for not only a higher duration, but a greater amount. And our partners in planning and zoning, so this is a flood mitigation effort, but our partners in planning and zoning who are more tuned in to the developments that are happening are evaluating those. So I don't have like a really good answer for you, because just like the other gentleman said, there's a development that may occur either right on top of where he lives or very near. And I can't answer that.
Can you tell me what's going on there? What is all of your development? We can't get out Newcut. We can only go one way on Newcut. When I leave my house, I have to go where all your construction, all of the dynamite blasting that's been going on, that's the only way I get to go out my drive. I can't go the other way where there's no construction, all of the culverts have been put in, everything is fine, no problem.
There's been 22 culvert pipes from the other side of the road.
That's gonna come onto
that
Newcut
have been
Creek.
put under Newcut Road, under 24 inches to add
So
water.
all
to
that's
the
coming.
Newcut Creek.
So I do know,
But you're allowing a development of over 200 houses to be built less than an eighth of a mile upstream from our home. An eighth of a mile, a couple of hundred houses, and we've lost 5 bridges and 1 house
With no development.
already.
right,
And now you're, I don't understand the
okay, let me tell you.
adding 200 houses.
All right. I can't really talk about that. However, I do know that we did have another meeting specifically about New Cut, where you did voice those exact same opinions. And we did come to some mutual understanding that we were going to give you another access out. We did describe the work that was going on down there. So I think that, I understand you're bringing it up again. I was not specifically at the meeting.
But I still can't get out.
I will make sure that you do have the key to the lock or the combination to the lock.
We've been told that before.
Well,
And let's even drop the subject of which way do we go? Why, if you have all this water coming at us, and that's what the purpose of this meeting is, why in God's name would you build 200 more houses an eighth of a mile from
Right.
my home, uphill, upstream, and divert the water with 22 24-inch culvert pipes under Newcut Road?
Sure.
To pump the water from the other side of the road where that development is into Newcut Creek, to where, when I bought the place back in '01,
well, I don't mean,
about 6 to 8 feet wide.
right.
Now, it's 33 feet wide.
I understand. What I'm going to do is, okay, what I'd like to do is talk to you after the meeting. There may be other people that want to ask some questions. All of these questions have been brought up before, and if we haven't given you the combination, I'll make sure you have the combination, but I do want to talk to you afterwards. And like I've said before, I can't necessarily address new development that's happening. I'm not the person that can really answer that question for you, but I'll certainly talk to you as long as you want to talk after the meeting tonight. Okay? And I do understand that. I understand that.
You're adding so much more water
Right.
to hit those people, so I don't understand.
Yeah. And I'll explain that. Do you have a question, Ken?
Yes, my name's Kenneth Norton. I'd like to know a bit more about the full proposal for a dry duck line on the new cut. Are you proposing that that be dammed so that the flood water is spread out? What is that black line?
One answer.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go back to that slide so we can look at it. So that black embankment, yes, so it would function as a dam. The yes. Yeah, so the idea would that there would be an opening for low flow, so the stream would pass through normally beneath this structure, and during major storm events, the water would back up behind that embankment with a, again, hypothetical, but a potential ponding area approximately the size of this red line. At least that was one of the team's conceptualizations of how much water could be stored. But yeah, so a permanent structure.
Are you confident that that structure will interfere with the same drive that you calculated?
So that's one of the challenges for the county to consider it. This would require possibly likely removal of the new cut in this area. So the new cut road. Yeah. Well, it would have to. I mean, so under this ponding scenario, the road would have to be removed. So I mean, it would be closed. But again, this was a conceptual idea. Yeah, and that may be the case, but thank you.
Well, in defense of the Corps' thinking, I think that in defense of the Corps' thinking, we welcomed ideas, okay? And not everything you throw against the wall is going to stick, but it can also germinate other ideas, okay? So I think that everything has value. That's how I think of it, and I understand that there could be those of you who think that losing New Cut Road would be a non-starter, but it's an idea, right? Yes,
Can I just ask if
you can.
if you're getting rid of New Cut Road, the people that live on New Cut Road, where do you go?
Well, I'll just say again that it's an idea, and that we welcome the ideas, and anything that you throw and sticks to the wall can have some merit. But like I said, that maybe it's not an acceptable idea, but it can germinate other ideas, and I think that's the kind of collegial peer review that we welcomed. So I'm just saying that in defense of the Corps saying that, I still think that it has merit to share as an idea. Yes. That's correct. That's correct. Mm-hmm.
And I just want to add to that a bit too. And, as Mark mentioned, the Corps is not proposing any of this. We came up with ideas for them to consider. And I think when we were looking at the modeling, it showed that there's still a lot of water coming down that new cut, and there wasn't a big option to try to hold that back. So we just recommended that be looked at. Again, that's back of the envelope red on a line of the most it could potentially store. But obviously, smaller dams and so forth could be looked at. So it's just something that we wanted to mention to them when we looked at the hydraulics, that maybe they should, maybe consider looking at that area a little bit more for some more storage. Again, it could be bigger, smaller. They could not pursue it at all. It's just something we wanted to bring to their attention that we noticed. Yes.
That's all fine, well and good, and very nice, but when you're sitting in a meeting and you're living on this road and somebody says that they're gonna take it away, but they're not giving you any other alternatives, like, okay, we might take New Cut away, but we're gonna give you this out. This is where, when you leave your drive, this is where you're gonna go. I can't tell you what you've done to me, sitting here listening in a meeting with people where you say, we might close New Cut, but you live on it. Too bad, so sad.
Okay. Okay.
I
That's Anthony.
can't even tell you what you've done to me. We've lived this way since the 2016 flood. Not only 18, but 2016.
Okay, I understand. And it's not in the plan. It's only in the Corps of Engineers considerations, okay? So I don't want to get people all upset about it. We have our flood mitigation strategy that we're pursuing. Is there another question? Yes.
I think it's great that the Corps of Engineers has opened up the envelope and considered all these possible ideas, and to me, I'm very happy to see that there's only a few that have come up extra considerations, and some of them quite probably aren't going to happen, certainly the way they've gone. Well, people all look at, the question I have is, they've all seemed to be so far looking at the implementation as if it could be done. Have we yet identified any showstoppers for the construction, the culverts, especially the CSX line, which is the north tunnel and culvert closed? Any ideas of what?
So that's a good question. So far, no. And I think it's a good point that you make that sometimes a plan is just lines on a piece of paper. And I've said that before. And then when you get to, well, let's really design it and really see if it can be done, then that can be a completely separate issue. And you find out that there are fatal flaws in it. So far, the North Tunnel, so far we've identified projects that we just think are most important. The North Tunnel is most important. Maryland Avenue Culverts is most important. And I might be leaving off something else. You know, we think that the restoration of Main Street and taking the backs of the back of the buildings off of some of the Main Street and trying to get the stream unencumbered by these buildings. That's so far, and we've started design of the tunnels. We started the geotechnical report to figure out what the subsurface looks like. We've engaged CSX and have gotten some of their ideas about how and when they want to see certain elements of the design. So we're working with them and on both projects, Maryland Avenue culverts and the tunnel. So we don't feel as though at this particular juncture for those two projects that we're going to have you're always going to have technical issues, but no fatal flaws as of right now. Yes.
What is the status of the approximate status of the timeline for the project implementation, and what is the status of the budget?
Right. So the timeline on the tunnel in Maryland Avenue are hovering around a 5-year implementation. If we can keep it on track, keep it on schedule. There are a lot of things that can derail it, but right now, I think there's been a huge commitment by the administration to keep the North Tunnel and Maryland Avenue culverts and the restoration of Lower Main Street, to keep those 3 projects moving. And there's also been a huge commitment, we believe, will be coming from the state as well, and which has kind of spurred the county on to be even further committed. So I think that, and I don't play the lottery, okay? And if I could pick numbers, I would play the lottery instead of try to guess on the schedule of these projects. But I'd say that I think that, as much as we're touching this schedule, that we're still kind of looking at a 5, but I'll be conservative and I'll say, 5 to 7 year window for some of this, because there could be a disappointment that we'll realize in funding somewhere down the line that we haven't identified yet. But if things go as positively as they seem today, I think we're still looking at a 5 to 7 year window. Yes. Yes. So I'll answer the last question first. And actually, the Corps had recommended that we model these projects, and we think it's important to model these projects sequentially. I mean, we have this huge plan, and it would be terrible if we, built them haphazardly, right? So we are in the process of modeling the improvements, the flood mitigation improvements, in a sequential order that we expect to construct them. So we know what the improvements, incremental improvements, might be. That being said, any project that's under construction, and we'd like to start at the lower part first and work our way up, if it can happen that way. An example of the way it did not happen was Ellicott Mills Drive, which is actually a flood mitigation project that isn't even in this. It was washed out. It's kind of like in the middle of our system. It's not at the end or the beginning. It's kind of like in the middle. But that was designed for a much higher floodwater than the original design. But set that aside, there is no magic bullet project that once built will take care of everything while everything else gets built. So it's a system. And so all of the system, all the components of the system have to be in place for the whole thing to work. So that needs to be understood. So if one part of it, the North Tunnel, is under construction, and that can have the greatest impact on floodwaters if we were to get a flood while we're working on everything else. But if that's only partially done, it won't take all the floodwater that it could potentially, and we would still have a flood. So there is no one project is a silver bullet. The first part of your question is a little bit more nuanced, and I might need to ask McCormick Taylor, because in the initial modeling, everyone's talking about, well, did you include this development or did you include that one? And they're significant. But in the initial modeling, we looked at the entire watershed and we looked at the land use. And correct me if I'm wrong, we looked at the land use. And when the model was developed, we looked at that land use and said, well, that could be developed. So in the model, it was shown as developed. Okay, so then the future storms that were generated by the model took into consideration the land use at that time in 2016. So it should have captured on a much more global scale, it should have captured the development that could have taken place. But I think what's important about you asking the question, like the gentleman did before, was the model may not take into consideration the local impacts that disturbance near where you live can have on your house, right? Because it just doesn't take in, it's too big. The model is too big for that. So it's important, and the efforts that individuals are making to make sure that those developments are not having an impact or having the utmost minimal impact, that's an important effort that those people are doing. And the model, unfortunately, the model can't address that because we're looking at a 3.7 square mile watershed. So, yes. Last one, Liz.
Observation and then question comment. On the T1 pond, which is in the top tier, when you talked about your timeline, you didn't mention it at all. I'm curious about that, so that's one. And the other thing is that, you know, as you talk about the priority for the county has been to take care of downtown Main Street first, I can't help but wonder, it's a little bit like putting a beautiful roof on a house where you haven't shored up the foundation. Because you're doing all the work in downtown Ellicott City, it needs to be done, I'm not questioning that. However, there's nothing being done to stop the water uphill, upstream, from coming down and washing out everything that's being done. I don't understand.
So, yeah, and I guess it's my fault for the way that I was explaining it because, and you don't have all the information because you don't see our schedule. So I have to, I know. So, but for example, the H7 pond is in the furthest reach of the watershed, furthest northwest. And it looks like, you know, that's a project that's a surface water retention project, but that's going to move forward relatively quickly, especially in, right. So now, I know that you're interested in T1, so I'll talk a little bit about T1. So T1, and I don't recall whether T1 is in the list, is it? Can you go to the slide? That's good. Let me see that. Right. It is in the top tier. And schedule-wise, this project is being done a little differently than any of the other projects. And so it has a somewhat different time frame. And this is a project where we're hoping to do it as a P3. And I know that you're aware of that. So it doesn't fall neatly into our schedule. But because I don't have everything to show, that we could talk after the meeting. But what I want to say is that it is on the timeline. It is on the schedule of projects, and we're focusing. We are focusing on Lower Main, but we're also focusing somewhere in the 8600 block as well, where we have the big culvert that we're trying to get across the street. And that's kind of like the point I was really trying to make, is that we are in other parts of the watershed doing some things. But then at the end of the day, what we really want to try and do is, instead of having that tarp over the front of a building, we want to have a business inside of it. So it's while we can do some other things at the same time. So, okay. So I'm getting the signal that I'm going to get hooked off of the stage. So I know we couldn't get to all the questions, and I do want to talk to some of you afterwards, but I also want to say that I do appreciate you coming out tonight and asking good questions and being patient with the presentation and trying to absorb all the information. So thank you.